a black teenager, bright and full of hope, boards a flight, her heart racing with excitement. Zara Matthews, a straight-A student and a rising star in her community, is flying first class for the first time, a reward for her academic excellence. But when she steps into the cabin, everything changes. A flight attendant, blinded by prejudice, singles her out, questioning her ticket and her right to be there, humiliating her in front of the other passengers. The tension mounts as Zara quietly holds her ground, her composure unshaken, even as the whispers around her grow louder. But just minutes later, the airline's founder, traveling incognito on the same flight, steps forward. What happens next sends shockwaves through the cabin and the world. Stay with me. This is a story of resilience, accountability, and transformation. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today. If you believe in standing up for dignity and justice, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories that challenge perspectives. The morning began in stillness. Golden light filtered through the lace curtains of the Matthews home, spilling across the floor like spilled honey. Lyra Matthews, 15, sat cross-legged in the middle of the living room, her slim fingers tracing the edges of an old, weathered photo album. The leather cover, cracked with age, bore the initials, AW, a testament to the woman who had shaped her family's history. Next to her lay a sleek, modern carry-on bag, ready for the flight that would mark a milestone in her young life. Her grandmother, Alma Matthews, Mama Alma, to the family entered the room with deliberate steps. The tap of her cane on the hardwood floor was steady, purposeful, like the rhythm of a heartbeat. Though age had slowed her body, it had not dimmed the fire in her gaze. Alma carried the weight of battles fought long before Lyra's time. And today, she was sending her granddaughter into the world with more than just luggage. "Don't forget your tablet, sweetheart," Alma said, her voice warm but firm. Lyra looked up, her face glowing with a mix of excitement and nerves. "I've got it, Mama." She zipped her bag with a final flourish, then added, "First class. Can you believe it? This is the start of something amazing." Alma lowered herself into her armchair with the grace of a queen taking her throne. "Lyra," she began, "this isn't just about a flight. It's about what it represents. You're carrying more than a ticket, you're carrying the legacy of all who came before you." The words settled heavily in the air. Lyra's smile faltered for a moment, replaced by a thoughtful expression. The photo album beside her seemed to hum with the stories it held, black and white images of marches, protests, and sit-ins. Alma's younger self stared out from one of the photos, seated resolutely at a segregated lunch counter, her expression a mix of defiance and calm. "When I was your age," Alma continued, her voice dropping, "flying wasn't a simple privilege for people like us. I joined a sit-in at an airport once, whites-only, lounge. We sat and we stayed. And we made them see us." Lyra swallowed, feeling the weight of her grandmother's words. She knew the stories she'd grown up with them, but they seemed different now. More vivid, as if the past were reaching out to touch her. She tightened her grip on the pendant hanging around her neck, its gold engraving cool against her skin. "Courage is our inheritance." Just then, Lyra's phone buzzed. Her mother, Dr. Sienna Matthews, was on the other end, her voice warm with pride. "Good morning, superstar. Ready for your big adventure?" "Yes, Mom," Lyra replied, a hint of nervous laughter in her tone. "Mama Alma's giving me the full pep talk." As she should, her mother teased. "Remember, stay calm, think things through, call me as soon as you land." When the call ended, Alma reached for a small velvet box on the side table and handed it to Lyra. Inside was the pendant, delicate but heavy with meaning. "This belonged to my mother," Alma said, her voice thick with emotion. "She wore it when she marched in Selma. It's yours now. Let it remind you of who you are and where you come from." Lyra fastened it around her neck, its weight both comforting and daunting. "I'll make you proud," she whispered. "You already have," Alma replied. Blank. Underscore, blank. At the airport, Lyra moved through the terminal with wide-eyed wonder. The buzz of conversations, the crackle of announcements, and the distant roar of departing planes filled the air. Her first-class boarding pass felt foreign in her hand, like it belonged to someone else. As she approached the gate, she adjusted her carry-on bag and joined the short line for first-class passengers. That's when she saw her, a flight attendant with polished blonde hair, a pristine uniform, and a name tag that read, Stephanie Lang. Stephanie's smile was practiced and professional, but her eyes lingered on Lyra a bit too long. "Good morning," Lyra said politely, handing over her ticket. Stephanie's manicured fingers took the ticket, hesitating as her eyes flicked from Lyra to the boarding pass. Her tone was light, but condescending. "Are you sure this is the right line, dear?" Lyra's stomach tightened. She met Stephanie's gaze, her voice steady. "Yes, I'm sure. That's my seat 1A. Stephanie's smile didn't waver, but the corners of her mouth tightened. "We'll just double-check, won't we?" she said, scanning the ticket with a theatrical air of suspicion. The line behind Lyra began to murmur softly, the low hum of discomfort growing as passengers shifted their weight and glanced over curiously. Lyra forced herself to stand tall, her grip on the pendant tightening. She could feel every eye on her, the weight of their judgment pressing down like a heavy stone. But she refused to shrink. "I believe there's no mistake," Lyra said, her voice even. Stephanie handed the ticket back with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Enjoy your flight," she said, her tone dripping with insincerity. Lyra walked down the jet bridge, her heart pounding. As she stepped into the first-class cabin, she felt a mix of pride and unease. This was supposed to be a moment of triumph, but it already felt tainted. She was stowing her bag in the overhead compartment when the sharp clack of heels echoed behind her. Stephanie's voice sliced through the cabin's calm. "Excuse me, miss, are you traveling alone?" Lyra turned, her expression calm but her voice steely. "Yes, is there a problem?" Before Stephanie could answer, a senior flight attendant appeared, a black woman with graying hair and a name tag that read, Rose Winters. Rose's voice was soft but firm. "Is everything all right here?" Stephanie faltered, her cheeks flushing. "No problem," she said quickly. "Just ensuring all passengers are comfortable." Rose's eyes lingered on Stephanie, her gaze unyielding. "Good," she said evenly, before turning to Lyra. "Welcome aboard, sweetheart. Let me know if you need anything." Lyra nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you." As she took her seat, she exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The cabin settled into a quiet hum, but Lyra could still feel the tension in the air, the unspoken discomfort that buzzed just beneath the surface. Somewhere behind her, she heard the faint click of a phone camera. She adjusted the pendant around her neck, its weight a steady reminder of Alma's words, "Dignity is your armor." What Lyra didn't know was that the confrontation was far from over. It had already begun to ripple beyond the confines of the plane, igniting a storm that would challenge not just her, but everyone who witnessed it. Lyra Matthews settled into her first-class seat, her fingers brushing against the smooth leather armrest. The hum of the plane's engines provided a soothing backdrop, but beneath it, she could feel the ripple of discomfort spreading through the cabin like an unseen current. She adjusted the pendant around her neck, drawing strength from its familiar weight. This flight wasn't just a reward for her academic achievements. It was a symbol of progress, one that carried the echoes of struggles she didn't live through but understood deeply. At first, the cabin was quiet, the kind of restrained calm that marked the moments before takeoff. Passengers fiddled with their seatbelts. Flight attendants moved briskly through their pre-flight routines, and the faint clink of glasses came from the galley. Lyra tried to focus on the screen in front of her, but she couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. A man across the aisle, a middle-aged executive in a sharp navy suit, glanced her way. His gaze lingered a second too long before he turned back to his newspaper, his lips tightening ever so slightly. Lyra caught sight of the headline on his page, "The Changing Face of America." She let out a slow breath and turned her attention to the window. Watching the ground crew bustle below, the world outside felt distant, almost unreal. Then, it began. Stephanie Lang, the flight attendant who had questioned her at the gate, returned to the cabin, her posture impeccably straight, her heels clicking against the carpet. She carried herself with the kind of forced confidence that seemed to dare anyone to question her authority. As Stephanie moved down the aisle, her eyes scanned the passengers, pausing, inevitably, on Lyra. "Miss Matthews," Stephanie said, her voice polite but cold. "I'd like to confirm your meal preference. Were you sure about the special request?" Lyra blinked, caught off guard. "I didn't make a special request," she replied, her voice steady. Stephanie tilted her head, her smile thin. "Oh, my mistake. I just assumed. The word hung in the air, sharp as glass. Lyra felt a flush of anger rise in her chest. But she pushed it down. She wouldn't let this woman reduce her to a confrontation. Instead, she met Stephanie's gaze with quiet resolve. No special requests. Thank you. Stephanie's smile faltered for the briefest moment before she nodded and moved on. But the damage was done. Lyra could feel the subtle shift in the cabin passengers stealing glances at her. Whispers passing between them like smoke. It was a pattern she recognized, the way suspicion and judgment could disguise themselves as curiosity. How prejudice could hide behind a veneer of civility. The tension rose when the plane finally took off. Climbing through the clouds, Lyra tried to focus on the book she'd brought. But her thoughts kept circling back to Alma's stories, how her grandmother had faced this same subtle exclusion. Time and time again, she thought of Alma's words, "Dignity is your armor." But even armor, she realized, could feel heavy. The hum of the engine seemed louder now. Almost oppressive. Lyra noticed Stephanie lingering at the front of the cabin. Her phone in hand. She wasn't being discreet, her glances toward Lyra were obvious. Her expression tight with some unspoken emotion. And then there was the click, the unmistakable sound of a camera shutter. Stephanie's hand moved quickly, but not quickly enough. Rose Winters, the senior flight attendant, appeared like a storm breaking over calm waters. Her voice was calm, but her eyes carried the weight of decades of hard-earned wisdom. "Stephanie," Rose said, her tone sharp enough to slice through the tension. "A word, please." Stephanie stiffened but followed Rose toward the galley. Lyra couldn't hear their exchange, but she could feel the energy shift. A low murmur of unease rippling through the cabin. Across the aisle, the businessman set down his newspaper, his gaze flicking between Lyra and the galley with a frown. A young woman a few rows back, brightly dressed. Earbuds in, pulled one out and leaned toward her seatmate. "Did you see that?" she whispered. The whispers grew louder. Lyra clenched her fists in her lap, willing herself to stay calm. But then, the man across the aisle leaned forward, his voice loud enough for Lyra to hear. "This is why I hate flying these days. Everything's a drama." Lyra turned to him, her voice steady but firm. "What do you mean by that?" The man blinked, surprised to be challenged. "I mean, why make a big deal out of nothing? People are too sensitive these days." Lyra felt her pulse quicken, the heat rising to her face. She thought of Alma, of the countless times her grandmother must have faced moments like this. Moments where she had to decide whether to speak or let it go. Lyra sat up straighter. "It's not nothing," she said, her voice carrying just enough to silence the murmurs around her. "It's about respect, and respect shouldn't be optional." The cabin went quiet again, save for the hum of the engines. The man looked away, muttering something under his breath. But Lyra didn't care. She turned back to her book, her hands still trembling. When Rose returned to the cabin, she paused by Lyra's seat. Her voice was low, but her words were firm. "You did good, kid. Don't let them rattle you." Lyra nodded, her chest tight. She adjusted the pendant around her neck, its cool weight grounding her. But even as she tried to focus on the story in front of her, she couldn't shake the feeling that this flight was far from over, that the storm brewing in the cabin was only just beginning. The plane cruised smoothly at 30,000 feet, its engines humming like a distant, unrelenting reminder of the journey ahead. Lyra sat in her seat, staring out at the endless expanse of clouds, her hands folded tightly in her lap. From the outside, she appeared calm, composed even, but inside, a storm brewed. Every glance, every whisper, every wordless judgment weighed on her like a boulder pressing against her chest. The first-class cabin had fallen into a strained quiet, the kind of silence that wasn't peaceful but charged with unspoken tension. Passengers who had previously avoided looking at her now stole quick, furtive glances. The businessman across the aisle continued flipping through his newspaper, though his movements were slower, almost theatrical, as if his disinterest was something he wanted Lyra to notice. Rose Winters moved efficiently through the cabin, her demeanor steady and composed. Yet her eyes, sharp and knowing, flicked toward Lyra with a quiet reassurance every time she passed. Rose knew what this was. She had seen it before, the slow, creeping way a simple act of bias could fester into something more insidious. And she also knew how easily these moments could escalate if not carefully navigated. But the next escalation came from an unexpected place. Stephanie Lang, The flight attendant, who had already drawn a line in the sand, returned to the cabin. This time, she wasn't alone. She was accompanied by another flight attendant, a younger woman with nervous eyes and an air of uncertainty about her. Stephanie stopped near Lyra's seat, her voice raised just enough to carry. "Miss Matthews," she began, her tone overly polite, almost saccharine, "we've noticed your bag in the overhead compartment seems a bit oversized. Are you sure it complies with the airline's policies?" Lyra's head snapped up, her expression incredulous. "It was fine at security," she replied, her voice steady but edged with disbelief. "No one said anything then." "Well," Stephanie said with a tight smile, "perhaps they missed something. Would you mind taking it down so we can verify?" The tension in the cabin spiked like a sudden drop in altitude. Passengers exchanged glances, their discomfort palpable. The young woman seated across the aisle shifted uneasily in her seat, her earbuds now forgotten. Lyra's heart raced, but she met Stephanie's gaze with calm defiance. Slowly, deliberately, she unbuckled her seatbelt and stood. She reached for her bag, her movements measured, her mind flashing back to Alma's words, "Dignity is your armor." The businessman across the aisle muttered something under his breath. Lyra caught the words, "causing trouble," and felt her grip tighten on the handle of her bag. She lowered it to the floor and looked at Stephanie, her voice steady. "Here it is. Feel free to check." Stephanie hesitated, her composure slipping for a fraction of a second. She hadn't expected Lyra to meet her challenge so directly. Still, she knelt down, unzipping the bag with deliberate care, her hands moving through its contents as if searching for some justification for her actions. Passengers watched in stunned silence. The tension was no longer just unspoken, it was suffocating. The younger flight attendant shifted awkwardly beside Stephanie, her discomfort plain. Rose Winters appeared at the edge of the cabin, her eyes narrowing as she took in the scene. "Stephanie," Rose said, her voice calm but firm, "what exactly are we looking for?" Stephanie froze, the question hanging in the air like a thundercloud. "Just ensuring compliance," she replied, her tone defensive. Rose stepped forward, her presence commanding. "This young lady has already been through security. Unless there's a specific concern, I suggest we let her enjoy her flight." Stephanie stood, her cheeks flushed. "Of course," she said, her tone clipped. She turned back to Lyra, avoiding her gaze. "Apologies for the inconvenience." Lyra didn't respond immediately. She simply knelt, zipped her bag closed, and placed it back in the overhead compartment. When she sat down again, she felt the eyes of the cabin on her, some sympathetic, others neutral, a few hostile. She refused to look away. But the moment wasn't over. Across the aisle, the businessman set down his newspaper with an exaggerated sigh. "Unbelievable," he muttered, his voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Rose turned her attention to him, her expression unreadable. "Is there something you'd like to say, sir?" He shrugged, his tone dripping with disdain. "Just seems like a lot of fuss over nothing. Some people can't help but make everything into a spectacle." Lyra's chest tightened, but before she could speak, another voice cut through the tension. "It's not nothing." The young woman who had been sitting quietly across the aisle now leaned forward, her eyes fixed on the businessman. "You saw what happened. That wasn't a fuss. That was someone being singled out for no reason." The businessman scoffed, waving her off. "Oh, please, let's not make this about something it isn't." "It is about something," the woman shot back, her voice growing stronger. "You just don't want to admit it." The argument sent ripples through the cabin, passengers turning to watch as the exchange unfolded. Rose stepped forward, her voice cutting through the noise. "That's enough," she said, her tone sharp but controlled. "Everyone, please remain calm." Lyra sat back in her seat, her pulse pounding. She glanced at the young woman, who offered her a small, reassuring smile. For the first time since boarding the plane, Lyra felt a flicker of solidarity, proof that not everyone in the cabin would turn a blind eye. But the tension lingered, thick and suffocating. Somewhere behind her, a passenger muttered something inaudible, the words carrying an unmistakable edge. Lyra tightened her grip on the pendant around her neck, her resolve hardening. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about something far bigger, a truth she couldn't ignore, no matter how heavy it felt. The engines hummed on, the plane slicing through the clouds as the storm brewing inside the cabin continued to grow. The cabin had grown heavier, The kind of weight that settled not in the air but in the heart. Lyra sat in her seat, staring at the clouds outside, trying to focus on their endless, unjudging expanse, but no matter how hard she tried, the murmurs of the passengers and the recent confrontation with Stephanie Lang echoed in her mind. The words weren't loud, but they carried the unmistakable edge of judgment, slicing through the calm facade she tried to maintain. She adjusted the pendant around her neck, its engraving cool against her fingers. Courage is our inheritance. Lyra closed her eyes, hearing Alma's voice as if her grandmother were sitting beside her. Dignity isn't about silence, child, it's about knowing when to speak. A sharp voice broke her thoughts. Excuse me, ma'am, came from a few rows back. Clear and pointed. Lyra turned, her heart tightening. A man, a heavy-set figure with a booming voice, had called over Rose Winters. His tone carried the air of entitlement that Lyra had grown adept at recognizing. This flight, he said, gesturing vaguely toward the cabin, is starting to feel like a soapbox for certain statements. Some of us just want to travel in peace. Rose's expression didn't waver, though her jaw tightened slightly. Sir, she said evenly, if you're uncomfortable, I encourage you to speak with respect. This is a shared space. The man's face reddened, but he didn't back down. Respect? I just think there's a time and a place for certain conversations. And it's not here. 30,000 feet in the air. Lyra felt the anger rise in her chest, sharp and hot, but before she could respond, Rose turned toward her with a subtle, calming gesture, a silent plea for patience. Rose then returned her gaze to the man, her voice firm. If you have any further concerns, I'd be happy to address them privately. The man grumbled but fell silent, his defiance now a quiet simmer. Rose moved down the aisle, her steps as measured as her words. When she passed Lyra's seat, she paused just long enough to whisper, "You're doing fine, don't let them pull you under." Lyra nodded, her throat tight, but as Rose walked away, Lyra's hands clenched into fists in her lap. It wasn't fine. Nothing about this was fine. In the galley, Stephanie Lang stood hunched over her phone, her perfectly composed exterior cracking. The video from earlier, the one she hadn't realized a passenger had recorded, was now spreading across social media. Her name wasn't mentioned, not yet, but the scene it captured was unmistakable. Her dismissive tone, Lyra's calm yet firm responses, and the uncomfortable murmurs of the cabin. Jenny Hart, the younger flight attendant who had been shadowing Stephanie, hesitated nearby. Is it bad? She asked softly. Stephanie snapped her head up, her expression sharp. Of course, it's bad, she hissed. People love to twist things into a spectacle. Jenny fidgeted with the edge of her apron. Maybe we should address it. You know, before it gets worse. Stephanie's face flushed with anger. Address it? And admit fault? That's not how this works. Jenny. But even as she said it, Stephanie's hands trembled. She could feel the scrutiny growing, not just from the passengers, but from her colleagues, from Rose, and perhaps worst of all, from herself. Deep down, a voice she had spent years ignoring whispered the truth. You were wrong. Back in the cabin, Lyra felt the storm brewing. The unease wasn't just hers anymore, it rippled outward, touching everyone in the confined space. She caught snippets of whispered conversations, some in support, others questioning her right to be there. One older woman, her hair pulled into a tight bun, leaned toward her seatmate and muttered, "It's always something with these people, isn't it?" Lyra's chest tightened. These people. Before she could speak, a new voice rose from across the aisle. It was the young woman who had stood up earlier, the one with the bright clothes and the earbuds now discarded. "Excuse me," she said, her voice loud enough to carry. "But maybe we should all ask ourselves why we're so uncomfortable right now." The cabin stilled, the hum of the engines now a distant background. "Because let me tell you," the young woman continued, her gaze sweeping across the passengers. "It's not her fault for standing her ground. Maybe it's ours for making her feel like she has to." A wave of murmurs followed her words, some approving, others dismissive. Lyra felt a surge of gratitude toward the woman, but it was quickly overshadowed by the heat of a man's voice from the back. "Why is everyone so sensitive these days? It's just a misunderstanding. People blow everything out of proportion." Lyra turned in her seat, her pulse pounding. She couldn't stay silent any longer. "It's not about sensitivity," she said, her voice steady but edged with steel. "It's about being seen. It's about being treated like I belong here just as much as anyone else." The cabin fell silent, her words cutting through the tension like a blade. Lyra felt every eye on her, but she refused to waver. She thought of Alma, her strength, her quiet defiance, and drew from it. Then, from the back of the plane, a faint sound emerged, a single clap. It was the young woman again, her hands coming together in slow, deliberate applause. Others joined in hesitantly, the sound growing louder, filling the cabin with an energy that was neither triumph nor defeat but something in between, something raw and unresolved. Rose watched from the galley, her heart heavy. She had seen these moments before, how they could galvanize change or deepen divisions. She stepped back into the cabin, her voice calm but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, I understand this has been a difficult flight for some of you. But let's remember that we're all traveling together. Let's try to treat each other with the respect and dignity we all deserve." The murmurs quieted, though the tension remained. Lyra leaned back in her seat, her breath unsteady but her resolve firm. She had spoken her truth, and no matter what came next, she wouldn't let it be silenced. The plane continued its journey, cutting through the clouds, but the storm inside was far from over. Lyra could feel it in her chest, heavy and unrelenting. This wasn't just a flight. It was a battle, one she hadn't asked for but wouldn't back down from. The cabin seemed to hum with a strange, electric tension. The applause that had erupted moments ago had dissipated, but its echoes lingered, leaving an uneasy quiet in its wake. Lyra Matthews sat still, her back pressed firmly against her seat, her heart pounding in her chest. The moment felt far larger than her, as if the weight of history itself had taken a seat beside her. Across the aisle, the businessman whose earlier disdain had been thinly veiled shifted in his seat. He adjusted his tie, his brow furrowed, his lips pressed into a line of visible discomfort. Meanwhile, the young woman who had clapped sat upright, her gaze steady and unflinching, daring anyone to challenge her. Stephanie Lang appeared at the front of the cabin, her posture stiff, her expression guarded. Her usual air of polished confidence was now replaced with something far less certain: fear. Perhaps, or shame. She scanned the rows of passengers, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Behind her, Rose Winters stepped into the aisle, her presence a calm but unyielding counterbalance to the growing tension. It was Rose who spoke first, her voice steady but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to remind everyone that this is a shared space. We understand that emotions are high, but let's all take a moment to breathe and collect ourselves." Her words were met with murmurs of agreement from some passengers, but not all. In the back of the cabin, the heavy-set man who had previously complained spoke up again, his voice loud and pointed. "This shared space feels more like a platform for drama," he said, his words cutting through the air like a blade. "Some of us just want to fly in peace." The murmurs rose again, louder this time, spreading like wildfire. Passengers turned to one another, their whispers a mixture of agreement, discomfort, and outright dissent. Lyra could feel the heat rising in her chest. But before she could respond, Rose's voice cut through the noise. "Sir," she said, her tone cool but commanding, "if you're unable to remain respectful, I'll have to ask you to address your concerns privately with the crew." The man scoffed, throwing his hands up in exaggerated frustration. "Respect? You're lecturing me about respect when this whole flight has been derailed by someone who—" He stopped short, his gaze flickering to Lyra, his words hanging heavily in the air. Lyra turned to face him, her voice sharp and unwavering. "By someone who what?" she asked, her tone daring him to finish his sentence. The man looked away, his bravado faltering. "Nothing," he muttered, sinking back into his seat. But the moment had already tipped the balance. A woman a few rows ahead turned in her seat, her face flushed with indignation. "I don't know why everyone's making this such a big deal," she said, her voice pitched high with irritation. "It's just one girl. Why does everything have to be about race?" The words hit Lyra like a physical blow. She felt the air leave her lungs, her fingers curling tightly around the pendant at her neck. Before she could speak, the young woman across the aisle leaned forward, her voice rising above the din. "It's not just about her," the young woman said, her tone fierce and unrelenting. "It's about all the times people like her are made to feel like they don't belong. It's about every moment people like you dismiss their experiences because it's easier than facing the truth." The cabin fell silent again, the weight of the young woman's words pressing down on everyone like a heavy fog. Lyra felt a surge of gratitude toward her, but it was quickly overshadowed by the growing sense of exhaustion that clawed at her chest. She wanted to fight, but she also wanted the fight to be over. In the galley, Stephanie leaned against the counter, her hands trembling as she scrolled through her phone. The video was everywhere now, shared, liked, commented on thousands of times. The caption beneath it was damning: "Flight attendant questions black girl's place in first class." She stared at the screen, her stomach twisting into knots. The comments were relentless, a mixture of outrage and condemnation. Some called for her to be fired. Others demanded the airline release a statement. Stephanie's breath quickened, panic creeping in like a tide. She felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to see Jenny Hart standing beside her. Her expression hesitant but kind. "Stephanie," Jenny said softly, "maybe it's time to say something to her." "I mean," Stephanie shook her head, her voice a harsh whisper. "And say what? That I'm sorry? That I didn't mean it? What difference would it make?" Jenny hesitated, then spoke with quiet conviction. It would make a difference to her. In the cabin, Lyra sat frozen, her mind spinning. She thought of Alma, her grandmother's stories, her strength, her quiet defiance. Alma had always told her that dignity was a choice, a shield to wield in the face of prejudice. But in this moment, Lyra felt that shield falter. The weight of the stares, the whispers, the pointed comments, it was too much. Then Rose knelt beside her, her hand resting gently on Lyra's arm. "You don't have to carry this alone," Rose said, her voice low and steady. "It's okay to let someone else stand with you." Lyra blinked back tears, her throat tight. She nodded, her grip on the pendant loosening slightly. "Thank you," she whispered. Rose stood, turning to face the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice rising with quiet authority. "This flight has shown us something important. It's shown us that we still have work to do, not just as individuals, but as a society. And that work begins with listening, with understanding, with choosing kindness over division." Her words hung in the air, the cabin once again falling into an uneasy silence. Lyra looked out at the faces around her, some ashamed, others thoughtful, a few still defiant. She didn't know what would happen when the plane landed, but she knew one thing: this fight wasn't over. It never had been. As the engines roared and the plane continued its journey, Lyra closed her eyes, drawing strength from Alma's words. "Dignity is your armor." She would hold on to that truth, no matter how heavy the fight became. The cabin, once bustling with the quiet rituals of travel, adjusting seatbelts, flipping through in-flight magazines, requesting coffee, now held its breath. It was a silence born of tension, not peace. Lyra Matthews felt it pressing against her, tightening like the straps of the seatbelt across her lap. Every glance in her direction, every hushed whisper, seemed to grow louder in the vacuum. She stared at the pendant around her neck, the words "courage is our inheritance" catching the light with each subtle shift of the plane. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. "Child, they'll try to make you question your place, but never let them forget you have a right to stand where you are." But the right to stand didn't make the standing easier. At the front of the cabin, Stephanie Lang emerged from the galley, her polished exterior now showing cracks. Her usual confidence had crumbled under the weight of the escalating situation. But still, she moved with purpose, or perhaps it was desperation. She cleared her throat, and the cabin turned its collective attention to her. "I'd like to take a moment to apologize," Stephanie began, her voice tight but measured, "to anyone who felt uncomfortable earlier." The words hung in the air, empty and insubstantial. Lyra tilted her head, her expression unreadable. The businessman across the aisle muttered, just loud enough for others to hear, "Damage control, that's all this is." The young woman who had defended Lyra earlier spoke up again, her voice sharp and cutting through the air like a blade. "Uncomfortable? That's what you're calling this? Why not call it what it is?" Stephanie flinched but held her ground. "I'm trying to address the situation," she said, her tone defensive now. "Are you?" the woman countered, crossing her arms. "Or are you just trying to cover yourself?" The tension in the cabin rose like a sudden drop in altitude. Passengers shifted in their seats, some nodding in agreement, others looking away, unwilling to involve themselves. Lyra felt her pulse quicken, her hands gripping the armrests. She wanted to speak, to cut through the noise, but her voice felt trapped beneath the weight of so many eyes. It was Rose Winters who stepped forward. Her calm authority was like an anchor in the storm. "Stephanie," she said, her voice even but firm. "If you truly want to make amends, then speak directly to the person affected. Don't hide behind vague apologies." Stephanie hesitated, her face pale. Her eyes darted toward Lyra. But she quickly looked away. "I didn't mean to offend anyone," she stammered, her voice faltering. "Offend?" Lyra's voice finally broke free. Clear and sharp. "This isn't about being offended. It's about being treated like I don't belong. Like I have to prove I deserve to be here." Her words sliced through the cabin, silencing the murmurs. Stephanie's face flushed, and for a moment, she looked as though she might respond. But whatever words she had died on her lips. She turned abruptly and walked back to the galley, leaving the cabin in a stunned silence. Minutes passed, but the air didn't settle. Lyra tried to focus on the clouds outside, but her reflection in the window stared back at her, unrelenting. Behind her, the whispers began to grow louder again, their tone more emboldened now that Stephanie had retreated. One voice stood out, a man's, deep and pointed. "This is why we can't have nice things. People making everything about race." Lyra turned slowly, her eyes locking on the man in the back of the cabin. He sat with his arms crossed, his expression a mix of irritation and defiance. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice calm but edged with steel. "You heard me," the man replied, his tone unapologetic. "You people always want to play the victim. Some of us just want to get to our destination without all this drama." The words hit Lyra like a punch, the air seeming to thin around her. She stood, her movements deliberate, her voice steady but laced with a quiet fury. "You think this is about drama? About playing the victim?" She gestured to the cabin, her eyes sweeping over the passengers. "This is about being seen. About being treated like I'm invisible or worse. Like I don't matter. And I'm tired of it." The cabin was deathly silent now. Even the businessman across the aisle had set his newspaper aside, his expression unreadable. The man in the back opened his mouth to respond, but Rose's voice cut through the air before he could speak. "That's enough," Rose said, her tone commanding. She moved down the aisle, stopping beside Lyra. "This young lady has every right to speak her truth. And if anyone in this cabin has a problem with that, they're welcome to take it up with me." Her words carried a weight that silenced even the most defiant murmurs. Lyra sat back down, her heart pounding, but her resolve unshaken. She felt Rose's hand on her shoulder, a brief, steadying gesture before the flight attendant moved on. In the galley, Stephanie sat on the jump seat, her hands trembling as she scrolled through her phone. The video had exploded online, with comments flooding in faster than she could read them. Most were critical, calling out her behavior as an example of systemic prejudice. Others were harsher, demanding her termination. Jenny Hart stood nearby, her expression torn. "Stephanie," she said quietly, "you need to do something, before this gets even worse." Stephanie looked up, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and frustration. "And say what, Jenny? That I'm a terrible person? That I didn't mean to let my biases show? No one's going to believe me." Jenny hesitated, then spoke with quiet conviction. "They'll believe you if you're honest. If you take responsibility." Stephanie's breath hitched, the weight of Jenny's words settling heavily on her shoulders. As the plane continued its journey, the tension in the cabin remained thick. But something had shifted. Lyra felt it, a quiet, unspoken ripple of solidarity from some of the passengers. The young woman across the aisle offered her a small smile, and even the businessman avoided her gaze, his earlier bravado replaced with a sullen silence. Lyra adjusted the pendant around her neck, its weight grounding her once more. She didn't know what would happen when the plane landed, but she knew one thing for certain: she wouldn't let this moment define her, not in the way they wanted. She would carry it forward, turning their attempts to diminish her into something far greater. The hum of the engines filled the cabin as the clouds parted, revealing the ground far below. The flight wasn't over, but Lyra could feel the weight of the world waiting for her when it was. And she was ready to meet it. The steady hum of the plane's engines served as the only constant in a cabin charged with unspoken conflict. Passengers who had started the journey engrossed in their own concerns were now pulled into the silent storm that swirled around Lyra Matthews. Every glance, every whispered word, carried the weight of a question no one dared to voice aloud. How did it come to this? Lyra sat motionless, her hands resting on the armrests, her knuckles white. She could feel the tension in her shoulders, the exhaustion of carrying the stairs and whispers. But there was no room for collapse. She had seen Alma in moments like this, her grandmother's unyielding posture during sit-ins, her calm gaze as insults rained down. Lyra straightened in her seat, lifting her chin slightly. Alma always said dignity was a shield. Lyra clung to that idea now. But dignity couldn't silence the rising tide of murmurs. Stephanie Lang stood in the galley, the soft glow of her phone illuminating her face. She scrolled through the endless stream of comments on the now viral video. Another example of microaggressions in action. This is why representation matters. How is this still happening in 2025? Each line felt like a punch. A public trial playing out in real time. She looked up at Jenny Hart, the younger flight attendant who had been her shadow throughout the flight. What am I supposed to do? Jenny? Stephanie's voice cracked. The polished veneer she had worked so hard to maintain crumbling. I've already lost control of this. Jenny hesitated before replying, her voice soft but firm. You can still fix it. But it has to come from you, not the airline. Not Rose. You. Stephanie's chest tightened. She wanted to push back. To blame the passengers, the camera, the internet. But deep down, she knew the truth. She had been wrong. And now the entire world could see it. In the cabin, the silence broke when a woman in her 40s, seated 2 rows behind Lyra, leaned forward. I just don't understand why this is such a big deal. She said loudly enough for others to hear. Everyone's acting like she's some kind of hero. It's just a seat. The words hung in the air like an open wound. Raw and unfiltered. Lyra turned to face the woman. Her voice quiet but steady. It's not just a seat. It's the way people see you when you sit in it. Or when they think you shouldn't. The woman rolled her eyes, crossing her arms. Oh, come on. People deal with worse things every day. This is just overreacting. Lyra's chest burned with anger. But before she could respond, Rose Winters stepped into the aisle. Her presence alone was enough to draw attention. The veteran flight attendant stood tall, her voice steady as she addressed the cabin. Let's talk about what this is. Rose began, her eyes scanning the passengers. This isn't just about a young woman in first class. It's about the unspoken rules we all carry. The assumptions we make. The way we let those assumptions dictate how we treat each other. Her words were met with silence. Some passengers looked down, avoiding her gaze. Others, like the woman 2 rows back, stared defiantly, their expressions tight with resistance. Rose turned her attention to Lyra, her voice softening but still carrying the weight of authority. Miss Matthews didn't ask for this moment. But now that we're here, we owe it to her and to ourselves to ask why this happened. And what we're going to do about it. At the front of the plane, Stephanie could hear Rose's voice carry through the cabin. Each word felt like a reminder of her failure. She turned to Jenny, her throat dry. I don't know if I can do this. Jenny placed a hand on Stephanie's shoulder. You have to. Stephanie took a deep breath and stepped out of the galley. As she moved down the aisle, her polished shoes clicking softly against the carpet, the cabin seemed to hold its breath. All eyes followed her, some curious, others judgmental. She stopped beside Lyra's seat. The teenager looked up, her expression guarded but resolute. Stephanie opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She glanced at Rose, who gave her a small nod. Then back at Lyra. I need to apologize. Stephanie began, her voice trembling slightly. Not just for how I treated you, but for what it represents. I made assumptions about you that I shouldn't have. And those assumptions are part of something much bigger, something that people like me have let go on for far too long. Lyra's expression didn't change, but her eyes softened slightly. She could see the effort it took for Stephanie to say those words. But she also knew an apology wasn't enough. It never was. Thank you, Lyra said finally, her voice steady. But what matters is what you do next. Not just for me, for everyone. Stephanie nodded, tears welling in her eyes. You're right, and I promise, I'll do better. As Stephanie returned to the front of the plane, the energy in the cabin shifted. The tension that had weighed so heavily began to lift, though it didn't disappear entirely. Passengers exchanged glances, some thoughtful, others still uneasy. The businessman across the aisle picked up his newspaper again, though he didn't turn the page. Lyra leaned back in her seat, the weight on her chest easing slightly. She adjusted the pendant around her neck, the cool metal grounding her once more. She wasn't sure what awaited her when the plane landed, but she knew she had spoken her truth. And that was enough for now. The engines roared as the plane began its descent, the clouds parting to reveal the city below. The journey wasn't over, but Lyra felt ready to face whatever came next. Because this wasn't just about her. It never had been. This was about something far bigger, something worth fighting for. The plane's descent was steady, but the atmosphere in the cabin remained charged. Every passenger feeling the weight of what had transpired at 30,000 feet. Lyra Matthews sat motionless, her gaze fixed on the window. The sprawling city below coming into focus. Her heart raced not from fear, but from the awareness that this moment, this confrontation, would follow her long after the wheels touched the ground. Rose Winters stood in the aisle, her experienced eyes scanning the cabin. She wasn't looking for compliance with seatbelt regulations or stowed tray tables. She was watching the passengers, gauging the subtle shifts in their expressions, the unease that rippled like static in the air. This was no longer about just one flight attendant's actions or one young woman's resilience. This was about the undercurrents of a society that had quietly tolerated its own fractures for far too long. Stephanie Lang retreated to the galley, her composure barely holding. She leaned against the counter, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Jenny Hart approached her, cautious but resolute. "You did the right thing," Jenny said softly, her words carefully chosen. Stephanie shook her head, her voice a harsh whisper. "It's not enough. I apologized. But what does that change? The video's already out there. People have already made up their minds." Jenny hesitated, then placed a hand on Stephanie's arm. "It's not about what people think. It's about what you do next. You have a chance to be better. To show that this isn't who you are. But you have to mean it." Stephanie's shoulders sagged. She looked down at her trembling hands, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She knew Jenny was right. But knowing and doing were two different things. Back in the cabin, the whispers began to swell again, low murmurs rising like the hum of distant thunder. A man near the back of the plane leaned toward his seatmate, his voice loud enough for several rows to hear. "I don't see why this had to turn into such a spectacle. People are always looking for something to be offended about." Lyra heard the comment, her chest tightening. She closed her eyes, willing herself to stay calm. But the frustration bubbling inside her was impossible to ignore. She turned in her seat, meeting the man's gaze head-on. "Do you know what it feels like?" Lyra began, her voice steady but edged with steel. "To walk into a space and feel everyone's eyes on you? To have people question your right to be there. Not because of anything you've done, but because of what you look like." The man blinked, clearly unprepared for her directness. He opened his mouth to respond, but Lyra didn't give him the chance. "You don't see it because it's not happening to you," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "But for me and for people like me it's constant. It's exhausting. And it's not okay." The cabin fell silent, her words hanging in the air like a heavy fog. Some passengers looked away, uncomfortable. Others nodded subtly, their expressions thoughtful. Rose watched from the aisle, her face unreadable but her eyes full of quiet pride. The plane touched down with a soft jolt, the tires skimming the runway. The cabin erupted into the usual commotion, seatbelts clicking open, passengers reaching for their bags, but the tension hadn't dissipated. If anything, it had grown heavier, a collective awareness settling over the group. As the plane taxied to the gate, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've arrived at our destination. On behalf of the crew, thank you for flying with us today. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is turned off." Lyra's hands trembled as she gathered her things, the enormity of what awaited her on the ground weighing heavily on her. She could hear the faint buzz of voices outside the cabin, reporters, onlookers, the chaotic hum of a story that had already taken flight. When the doors opened, Rose was the first to step into the jet bridge. She turned to Lyra, her expression softening. "You don't have to face this alone," she said quietly. Lyra nodded, her throat tight. She adjusted the pendant around her neck, the weight of its meaning grounding her. She took a deep breath and stood, her movements deliberate. As she stepped into the jet bridge, the noise hit her like a wave. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and a crowd of onlookers pressed against the barriers. Lyra paused, her resolve faltering for a moment. But then she felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see Rose beside her, her steady presence like a lifeline. One step at a time, Lyra told herself. One step at a time. The terminal was chaos. Reporters thrust microphones toward Lyra, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of questions. Miss Matthews, how do you feel about the video going viral? Do you believe the airline's apology was sufficient? What message do you have for people watching this unfold? Lyra's heart pounded, her chest tightening under the scrutiny. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could find the words, a familiar voice broke through the noise. Let her through. The crowd parted slightly, revealing a tall, commanding figure. Alma Matthews stood at the edge of the terminal, her cane in one hand, her expression fierce and unyielding. Lyra's breath hitched as she locked eyes with her grandmother. In that moment, the noise faded, the chaos receding like a distant tide. Lyra rushed toward Alma, wrapping her arms around her in a tight embrace. I'm so glad you're here, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. You've done well, child, Alma replied, her voice steady and sure. But the fight isn't over. It never is. As they walked toward the exit, reporters continued to shout questions. Their cameras still rolling. Lyra stopped suddenly, turning to face them. The crowd hushed, their microphones poised, waiting. This isn't just about me, Lyra said, her voice clear and unwavering. This is about every person who's ever been made to feel like they don't belong. It's about the small moments that build into something much bigger. And it's about standing up, even when it's hard. Her words carried through the terminal, the weight of them undeniable. She turned back to Alma, who gave her a small nod of approval. Together, they walked toward the exit, their steps steady, their resolve unshaken. The ground beneath them felt solid. But Lyra knew the journey ahead would be anything but easy. Still, she was ready to face it because dignity, as Alma had always said, wasn't just her armor, it was her legacy. The terminal was loud, but not with the usual hum of rolling luggage and boarding announcements. It buzzed with the chaos of attention, reporters with cameras poised like weapons, microphones thrust forward in anticipation, and curious onlookers craning their necks for a glimpse of the girl at the center of it all. Lyra Matthews stood on the edge of this storm, her heart pounding, her breath shallow. Alma Matthews, her grandmother, was at her side, a steady presence in the swirling frenzy. Stay strong, child, Alma murmured, her hand resting gently on Lyra's arm. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of generations. The world can be noisy, but your truth will cut through it. Lyra nodded, adjusting the pendant around her neck. Courage is our inheritance, it read, and she clung to the words like a lifeline. The reporters pressed closer, their questions rising above one another in a crescendo of demands. Miss Matthews, do you believe this incident reflects systemic issues within the airline industry? Are you planning to take legal action? What's your message to the young people watching this unfold? Lyra raised her hand, a simple gesture that somehow commanded silence. She looked out at the sea of faces, their expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism, and took a deep breath. This isn't just about me, she began, her voice steady despite the knot tightening in her chest. This is about every person who has ever been told subtly or directly that they don't belong. It's about the small, everyday acts of exclusion that add up to something much bigger. Her words hung in the air, the weight of them pressing down on the crowd. Even the cameras seemed to pause, their lenses trained on her as though capturing something fragile and fleeting. I didn't ask for this attention, Lyra continued, her voice growing stronger. But now that we're here, I want to use it to say this. We all have a responsibility to be better, to see each other more clearly, to stand against prejudice, no matter how quiet or polite it may seem. The crowd erupted in questions again, but Lyra turned away, her focus shifting back to Alma. That's enough for now, Alma said softly, guiding her granddaughter through the crowd. You've said what needed saying. Let them wrestle with it. As they moved toward the car waiting to take them home, Lyra felt the enormity of the moment settle over her. The world outside the terminal wasn't any quieter. Her phone buzzed incessantly with notifications, texts, calls, social media tags. The video of the confrontation had reached millions by now, and every comment seemed to carry the weight of judgment. She scrolled through them briefly in the car, her heart sinking at the mix of reactions. Some were supportive, praising her courage and poise. Others were cruel, accusing her of seeking attention or playing the victim. The words felt like daggers, each one cutting deeper than the last. Put it away, Alma said firmly, her tone brooking no argument. The noise will always be there, Lyra, but you don't have to let it inside. Lyra hesitated, then locked her phone and placed it face down on the seat. I just want people to understand, she said quietly, her voice tinged with frustration. I want them to see what this is really about. They will, Alma replied, her gaze fixed on the passing cityscape. But not all at once. Change is slow, child. It doesn't come because of one moment. It comes because people like you keep speaking up, keep pushing forward. When they arrived home, the house was quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos of the terminal. Lyra sat on the couch, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea Alma had made for her. The pendant around her neck felt heavier now, as though it carried not just her grandmother's legacy but the weight of the day's events. Alma sat beside her, her cane resting against the armrest. You did well today, she said, her voice warm but firm. But the hardest part isn't over. Lyra looked up, her brows furrowed. What do you mean? Alma smiled, a sad, knowing smile. The hardest part is living with the knowledge that not everyone will hear you. That some will refuse to listen. And knowing that you'll have to keep speaking anyway. The next day, the world hadn't quieted. News outlets picked up the story, framing it in headlines that ranged from supportive to dismissive. Civil rights leaders weighed in, praising Lyra's composure and calling for systemic reforms in the airline industry. But the backlash was loud, too. Social media buzzed with arguments, many centering not on the incident itself but on whether it should have been a story at all. Lyra stayed home, her phone turned off, her world reduced to the sanctuary of Alma's living room. But the quiet was short-lived. That afternoon, a knock at the door shattered the stillness. Alma opened it to find a woman standing on the porch, clutching a notebook and a pen. She was middle-aged, with kind eyes and a nervous smile. I'm sorry to bother you, the woman said, glancing past Alma to where Lyra sat on the couch. I'm a journalist. I'd like to hear her story if she's willing to share it. Alma turned to Lyra, her expression unreadable. What do you think, child? Lyra hesitated, her fingers tightening around the pendant. This was another choice, another moment where her voice could either rise or falter. She thought of Alma's stories, of the courage it took to sit at segregated counters, to march through hostile streets. She thought of the young woman on the plane who had clapped for her, and the countless others she might never know who needed to hear what she had to say. She stood, her movements slow but deliberate, and walked to the door. I'll tell you, she said, her voice steady, but not just for me. For everyone who's ever been told they don't belong. The journalist nodded, her pen poised, ready to capture every word. And as Lyra began to speak, she felt the weight of the noise lift, replaced by something far more powerful, her truth. Unyielding and unafraid, the day began quietly, the kind of stillness that feels like the world holding its breath. But Lyra Matthews knew better. The silence wasn't peace, it was the anticipation of what was to come. She sat in her grandmother's living room, sunlight spilling across the hardwood floor. As Alma moved methodically in the kitchen, the smell of brewing coffee filled the air, grounding Lyra in the familiar. Though her thoughts were anything but calm. The journalist had published her story the day before, a carefully written piece that captured the events of the flight and the weight of Lyra's words. It was raw, honest, and deeply personal, but its release had only amplified the storm. News outlets debated the incident. Pundits picked apart her every statement, and social media blazed with polarized opinions. Lyra's phone buzzed incessantly on the table beside her. She stared at it, unwilling to pick it up. Each vibration felt like a reminder of the world's unrelenting scrutiny. Answer it or turn it off. Child, Alma said from the doorway, her voice cutting through Lyra's hesitation. The buzzing is worse than the noise inside your head. Lyra managed a small smile. But she didn't reach for the phone. I just wish I could pause everything for a minute. Just breathe. Alma walked over, her cane tapping softly against the floor, and sat beside her. The world won't pause, Lyra. It never has. But that doesn't mean you have to let it rush you. By mid-morning, the house was no longer quiet. Calls poured in from advocacy organizations, civil rights groups, and even a few celebrities who had taken to social media in support of Lyra. A prominent congresswoman had tweeted, Lyra Matthews reminds us that dignity is a right, not a privilege. Let's continue the fight for equality in all spaces. But the backlash was equally loud. Commentators on cable news questioned whether the incident was blown out of proportion. One host asked, Is this really about racism? Or are we projecting our own biases onto an innocent misunderstanding? Lyra had heard the clip earlier that morning, and it played on a loop in her mind like a relentless echo. By the time the doorbell rang at noon, Lyra felt like she was drowning in the weight of it all. Alma opened the door to find Rose Winters standing on the porch. Her expression a mixture of determination and empathy. "I came to see how you're holding up," Rose said, stepping inside. She glanced at Lyra, her sharp eyes softening. "You've been thrown into the deep end, haven't you?" Lyra nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't think it would get this big." Rose sat across from her, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "It's always bigger than we expect," she said, "but that's because it's not just about one moment. It's about all the moments that came before it and all the ones that will follow." Alma nodded in agreement, her voice calm but resolute. "You're not just carrying your story, Lyra, you're carrying theirs too. The ones who couldn't speak. The ones who weren't heard." Later that afternoon, Lyra received an email that shifted the weight of the day. It was an invitation to speak at a town hall being organized by a coalition of civil rights groups. The event, scheduled for the following week, would be broadcast nationally, a platform far larger than anything Lyra had imagined. She stared at the screen, her heart racing. "I don't know if I can do this," she said, looking up at Alma and Rose. "What if I say the wrong thing? What if I make it worse?" Alma walked over and placed a hand on Lyra's shoulder. "You'll say what's in your heart, and that will be enough." "It always is," Rose added. "The world doesn't need perfect, Lyra. It needs honest, and you've already proven you can do that." The day of the town hall arrived quickly, the hours slipping away in a blur of preparation and nerves. Lyra stood backstage in a small auditorium, the noise of the crowd filtering through the heavy curtains. She wore the pendant Alma had given her, its weight a steady reminder of the legacy she carried. Alma stood beside her, her cane tapping lightly against the floor as if marking the rhythm of her heartbeat. "You've got this, child," she said, her voice firm but warm. "Remember, you're not just speaking for yourself. You're speaking for all of us." When Lyra's name was announced, the applause was thunderous, but it did little to calm the storm in her chest. She stepped onto the stage, the bright lights blinding her momentarily. As she approached the podium, the room fell silent, hundreds of eyes fixed on her. She gripped the edges of the podium, her hands trembling slightly, and took a deep breath. "Good evening," she began, her voice steady despite the knot in her throat. "A few days ago, I boarded a plane as just another passenger. I didn't expect to find myself here, speaking to all of you. But what happened on that flight wasn't just about me, it was about something much bigger." The audience leaned in, the weight of her words drawing them closer. "It was about the quiet ways we tell people they don't belong. The subtle looks, the whispered comments, the unspoken rules that define who gets to feel comfortable and who doesn't." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. "I've learned that change doesn't come from silence. It comes from speaking up. Even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." Her voice grew stronger, each word carrying the weight of her conviction. "We have a choice, all of us. We can look away, pretend it's not our problem. Or we can face it head on. We can choose to see each other not for our differences, but for our shared humanity." The room erupted into applause, a standing ovation that seemed to shake the very walls. Lyra stood tall, the pendant around her neck gleaming under the stage lights. In that moment, she felt the weight of Alma's legacy, of her own courage, and of the countless voices she now carried. The noise of the world hadn't quieted, but for the first time, Lyra felt like she had found her place within it. The applause from the town hall still echoed in Lyra Matthews' mind as she sat alone in the quiet of her grandmother Alma's living room. The night outside was calm, the kind of stillness that followed a storm. But Lyra knew better. This wasn't the end, it was only the eye of the storm. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her, the screen lighting up with notifications. Every message, every tag, every headline was a reminder of how far her story had traveled. Lyra Matthews, a voice for a new generation. Teen sparks national conversation on implicit bias. Courage at 30,000 feet. But not all the headlines were kind. Overreaction or revolution? One article questioned. Another dismissed her entirely. Teen's viral video sparks outrage and division. The comments were worse. Words like attention seeker and race baiter scrolled endlessly across her screen. interspersed with messages of support that felt drowned by the noise. Lyra turned the phone face down and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. The weight of the world's gaze was suffocating. Alma entered the room, her cane tapping softly against the floor. She carried 2 mugs of tea, setting one on the table in front of Lyra. "You're quiet tonight," she said, her tone light but probing. Lyra sat up, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. "It's just a lot," she admitted. "I thought speaking out would feel like a victory. But it's like every word I say just brings more questions. More arguments." Alma sank into the chair across from her, her expression thoughtful. "That's because speaking out isn't the end of the fight, child. It's the beginning. You've planted seeds, but seeds don't grow without storms." The storm arrived the next morning. Lyra woke to find her name trending again. But this time it wasn't just the story of the flight or the town hall. A prominent public figure and outspoken pundit known for stirring controversy had posted a scathing critique of her speech. Lyra Matthews isn't a hero. She's a symbol of a culture obsessed with victimhood. The post had ignited a firestorm, with supporters and detractors clashing in comment sections and news segments. It wasn't just about Lyra anymore, it was about what she represented. The conversation had grown beyond her, and yet she remained its unwilling centerpiece. Alma found her sitting on the back porch, staring out at the trees, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. "You can't outrun it, you know," Alma said, lowering herself into the chair beside her. "I'm not trying to outrun it," Lyra replied, her voice heavy with frustration. I didn't ask for this." "No one asks for the fight," Alma said, her tone gentle but firm. "But it finds you anyway. And when it does, you have to decide if you're going to stand or let it pass you by." That afternoon, Lyra received an invitation she couldn't ignore. A major television network wanted her to participate in a live debate about the incident, hosted by one of the country's most watched anchors. The thought of stepping into such a public arena terrified her. But Alma's words lingered in her mind. "You have to decide if you're going to stand." Rose Winters called her that evening, her voice steady and reassuring. "You don't have to do this alone," she said. "I'll stand with you, if you want." Lyra hesitated, but then nodded, as if Rose could see her. "Thank you," she said quietly. The day of the debate arrived with the kind of nervous energy that made Lyra's stomach churn. She stood backstage, Rose at her side, as the production team buzzed around them. The lights on the set were blinding, the cameras positioned like sentinels, waiting to capture her every word. The opposing guest, a sharp-tongued columnist who had written several scathing pieces about Lyra's overreaction, stood across the stage, his expression unreadable. The host greeted them both with practiced neutrality, but Lyra could sense the anticipation beneath his polished exterior. This was theater as much as it was discourse. When the cameras rolled, the debate began. "Lyra," the host started, his tone measured, "your story has sparked a national conversation about race, bias, and belonging. But some critics say it's been overblown, that this was simply a misunderstanding. How do you respond to that?" Lyra took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I think it's easy to dismiss something as a misunderstanding when it doesn't affect you," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But for me and for so many others, this wasn't just one moment. It's part of a pattern of being questioned, excluded, and made to feel like you don't belong." The columnist across from her smirked, leaning forward. "But isn't that exactly the problem? Turning every small incident into a cultural war? Maybe this was just someone doing their job." Lyra's chest tightened, but she held her ground. "If doing your job means treating someone differently because of how they look, then that's not just a job. That's a problem." The debate continued, the conversation growing more heated with every exchange. Lyra felt the pressure mounting, the weight of every word carrying consequences far beyond the stage. But with each rebuttal, with each pointed comment, she found her voice growing stronger. When the debate ended, Lyra walked off the stage feeling drained but resolute. Rose met her with a reassuring smile. "You held your own," she said. "That's not easy, especially when the deck's stacked against you." Lyra managed a small smile, but her thoughts were already racing. She knew this wasn't the end. The debate would spark more conversations, more headlines, more noise. But as she stepped outside into the cool evening air, she realized something. She wasn't afraid of the noise anymore. Because the noise wasn't just criticism or judgment. It was also change, slow and messy and imperfect. And for the first time, Lyra felt ready to face it, not because she had all the answers, but because she knew the questions were worth asking. Alma's words echoed in her mind. You planted seeds, child, now let them grow. The days that followed the debate were a whirlwind. Lyra Matthews became a name spoken in classrooms, living rooms, and newsroom panels across the country. Her story had evolved beyond the narrow confines of one incident. It had become a symbol, a spark in a much larger fire. But with that spark came the heat: supporters who saw her as a beacon of courage, and detractors who dismissed her as naive, even manipulative. At Alma's house, the phone rang endlessly. Reporters, activists, strangers offering words of encouragement or criticism. It felt as though the world had moved into their quiet corner of the neighborhood. Lyra tried to navigate it all with grace, but the pressure was relentless. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the world seemed momentarily still, Lyra sat with Alma on the back porch. The mug of tea in her hands was warm, but it did little to ease the chill that had settled over her. I'm tired, Mama Alma, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. It feels like no matter what I say, it's never enough. There's always someone waiting to tear it apart. Alma's gaze was steady, her expression soft but unwavering. Change isn't about being comfortable, child, it's about being true. The people who fight hardest against you aren't afraid of what you've done, they're afraid of what you represent. Lyra looked down at the pendant around her neck, its engraving catching the fading light. Courage is our inheritance. She traced the words with her thumb, her mind filled with images of her grandmother in her youth marching, sitting, standing. Alma had faced more than Lyra could imagine, and yet she remained unshaken. How did you do it? Lyra asked. How did you keep going when it felt like the world was against you? Alma smiled faintly, her eyes distant as though looking back across decades. I didn't do it alone, she said. None of us did. Every step I took, I knew there were others walking beside me even if I couldn't see them. And I knew that every fight was for more than just me. A week after the debate, Lyra was invited to speak at a rally organized by a coalition of civil rights groups. The event was held in a park downtown, a sprawling green space that had become a gathering place for protests and movements over the years. As Lyra approached the stage, she could see the crowd stretching out before her, hundreds of faces, young and old, all waiting to hear her speak. Her heart pounded as she stepped up to the microphone. The noise of the crowd quieted, replaced by an expectant hush. She scanned the sea of faces, her nerves threatening to overwhelm her. But then she spotted Alma near the front, her expression calm and resolute. Lyra took a deep breath, her hands gripping the edges of the podium. Good afternoon, she began, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. A few weeks ago, I boarded a plane thinking it was just another trip. I didn't know that flight would become a moment that changed my life and that it would spark a conversation far bigger than me. She paused, letting her words settle over the crowd. But that's the thing about moments like this, she continued. They're never just about one person. They're about all of us. They're about the stories we carry, the assumptions we make, and the ways we see or fail to see each other. The crowd murmured in agreement, a wave of energy rippling through the space. For too long, Lyra said, her voice growing stronger, we've let prejudice hide in plain sight. We've let it disguise itself as politeness, as professionalism, as just doing your job. But those small moments add up. They create a world where some people are always asked to prove their worth, to justify their place. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze sweeping the crowd. We have to do better. Not just by calling out the big, obvious acts of injustice, but by challenging the quiet, everyday ones. By looking at our own biases and asking hard questions. By choosing to see each other not as strangers, but as human beings. The applause that followed was thunderous. But Lyra didn't pause. She wasn't finished. I know this isn't easy, she said, her voice cutting through the noise. Change never is. It's messy and uncomfortable, and it takes time. But every step we take, every conversation, every moment of courage gets us closer to the world we want to live in. Her eyes found Alma's in the crowd, and she felt a surge of strength. And if there's one thing I've learned from my grandmother, it's this. Courage doesn't mean you're never afraid. It means you keep going, even when you are. The crowd rose to their feet, their applause echoing across the park. Lyra stood tall, the weight of the moment pressing down on her but no longer overwhelming her. She wasn't just speaking for herself anymore. She was speaking for the countless voices that had come before her and the ones that would follow. That night, back at Alma's house, Lyra sat on the porch once more, the noise of the day finally giving way to quiet. Alma joined her, a soft smile playing on her lips. "You did good, child," Alma said, her voice full of pride. Lyra nodded, her heart full but still heavy. "It doesn't feel like enough." Alma chuckled softly, her eyes twinkling. "It never does. But that's how you know it's worth doing." They sat in silence for a while, the night wrapping around them like a blanket. Lyra tilted her head back, looking up at the stars. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she felt ready to face it. Because courage wasn't just her inheritance. It was her purpose, and the fight, though far from over, was one she knew she could carry forward.